Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you. Thank you so much for coming. My name is David Ciccone. I'm an assistant professor of political science here at George Washington and associate director of PONARS, which is sponsoring this talk series called New Voices on Eurasia. We're delighted today to have Sasha de Vogel as our latest and greatest speaker. New Voices on Eurasia is a kind of unique series in Washington where we invite younger scholars from across the United States and North America more broadly to deliver kind of policy-oriented discussions and presentations of their academic research. So we have people from all different disciplines talking about most of the countries in Eurasia. Today we're delighted to have Sasha from the Weatherhead Center at Harvard University. She'll be talking about public opinion in Russia, but she's done a lot of fantastic work, especially on protests and social movements and kind of dissent more generally in Russia over the past decade with some really cool field work to boot. So I'm very excited for this talk. She's going to talk for about 35 to 40 minutes, and then we're going to open it up directly for question and answer for another 20 minutes or so. So please keep your questions to the end, unless you want interruptions, which we can do. We'll save them to the end. Save them to the end. And please, for all of our online audience, enter your questions into the chat, and we're pretty diligent about making sure that we include them in the presentation. So, Sasha, the floor is yours. Thanks so much for coming.
Thank you. I'm just gonna move this computer. So hopefully that's okay for the people on Zoom. Okay. So thank you all for being here, and thank you to David and the center for inviting me out. So in general, as David mentioned, I'm really interested in how Russians use alternative to democratic consultation to express their grievances to the government, how the government reacts to those grievances, and then sort of the outcomes of that on other things we care about, like political instability. A lot of my research has looked at protests as the way to express those grievances and how the government uses concessions to protesters. But since the war has begun, the protest environment has very dramatically changed. And I started doing this project on appeals to the presidential administration or appeals to Putin himself as sort of another way that Russians can use to communicate their grievances to the government. So as I mentioned, okay. So since the invasion of Ukraine, a lot of people are concerned with what regular Russians have been thinking. The Putin regime is very concerned with what regular Russians are thinking, and we know that because they have dramatically restricted freedom of speech since the invasion started and basically eliminated free media because they don't want certain opinions to be expressed publicly about the war. Russia is, of course, under the most severe sanctions regime in history, and part of how sanctions are supposed to work is that they're putting pressure on regular people to in turn put pressure on the government to end the war. In September, we had mobilization, which very dramatically changed the domestic aspect of the war, sort of changing it from this kind of abstract, more distant conflict to something that really affects people in their daily lives. And we also have a really rapidly changing socio-political situation in Russia. There were over 650 new laws passed last year. So a lot of things are changing on the ground that we care about. Also, I should say before I go on, I'm at the very end of a cold, so my voice is a little bit weird. So hopefully I won't have any like coughing attacks while I'm doing this. So in spite of all these concerns, we actually have less information than ever, as everyone in this room is probably aware, than what Russians are thinking. We don't have as much access to Russians as we used to, speaking as Western researchers. There's a big non-response problem with surveys. It's about 5% now. As I mentioned already, there's this big increase in censorship, propaganda, limits on free speech, the virtual elimination of the free media. And there's a lot of preference falsification given the sort of increasingly repressive atmosphere. People ask you a question in Russia, why, do you support the war? Why would you answer honestly if you didn't? These are problems not just for us, but also for the Putin regime. So in this project, I'm looking at appeals to the presidential administration as a source of additional insight into what Russians are thinking. So these appeals are voluntarily submitted and they are not anonymous. So they can give us insight into who I'm going to argue are regime supporting or pragmatic, maybe like regime neutral Russians. They're not going to be subject to preference falsification because doing this is voluntary. The rate of appeals has not declined since the war has started, and in many months has actually increased. So it's still a robustly used institution. It covers topics that we might not think to ask about in opinion polls because you can submit an appeal about anything. And this data is available to both the Russian government and to us because the Kremlin publishes monthly reports that summarize these appeals and their response to them. They've been doing that since 2009, and they are still doing it today. So the goals of this presentation are to introduce you to this data. Again, it's a publicly available, although somewhat unwieldy, data source. I'm going to illustrate some changes in the topics of these appeals from January 2021 to December 2022, and I'm going to draw some implications based on those changes. I'm going to start by just going over what this system is. How do you do it? Why would anyone use this system? Who's using it? And what role it plays for the regime. I'm going to talk a little bit about the data itself, which, as you can imagine, is pretty messy. And then I'm going to go through some descriptive findings about the military, economic problems, political grievances, and social policies. And then I'm going to give you some takeaways. So what is this system? So the process of appealing to the president is governed by a federal law. Anybody in Russia has, and actually outside of Russia, has the right to do this. An appeal is any proposal, complaint, or application for assistance, and that includes like questions and requests for information as well. So by this law, the government must not only consider each appeal, they also have to do additional investigation and research into what's happening, and then assign responsibility for this problem. So it's more than just a cursory response, they actually have to do something. And they have to do that within 30 days in general, with a couple of exceptions. These appeals cannot be anonymous because you're trying to you're reporting a problem to the government that you want the government to try to solve. So you have to provide your contact information so that they can get back to you on what they've done. Prosecuting people based on the content of these appeals is illegal. I don't know if you'd want to hang your hat on that right now, but that's technically the case. The law also requires the release of public reports that summarize these appeals and their outcomes, and those are posted on the Kremlin's website. So you can submit appeals online on the left here. This is the online portal where you can do that. You can attach any number of documents. You can attach videos. On the right, this is the presidential reception in Moscow where you can submit appeals in person. You can also do this in any major city, and you can submit them via the post. So here's some data about the format of these appeals over time. As you can see in orange, these are electronic appeals, the super vast majority in the period that I'm looking at. The white is in-person submissions, and the blue are letters. In all of the charts I'm going to be showing you, we'll have these two dashed lines. The first one is March 2022, the first month after the war started. And then the second one is September 22, when mobilization was announced. And also you can see even from this graph that clearly there's a pretty robust use of this institution even after the war started. So why would you do this? Why would you write a letter to Putin complaining about something? Doesn't that kind of, write your own arrest warrant? This is an autocracy. How can you complain about anything in an autocracy, right? This is actually a practice that has a really long tradition in Russia. It goes all the way back to several hundred years under the czars, writing letters to the czars or appealing in person to the czars to get them to resolve sometimes quite petty grievances and disputes. There was a robust practice of doing this under Stalin. Sheila Fitzpatrick has great work on letters to Stalin and to Soviet leaders that were published in newspapers to try to get sort of intercession to resolve problems. And of course, we all know about Direct Line, Putin's wonderful call-in show, where people, call him up or send video chats to ask for him to build roads in their town or give them marriage advice or to describe how great it will be to incorporate Crimea into Russia. So there's a long tradition of this in Russia. It's a way for people to get resolution for specific, often fairly material grievances. So you have a specific problem that the government's not performing the way it should, or other problems, and you want help with this specific issue. It's less about expressing dissent or ideological concerns. It needs to be, it's like a fairly concrete problem. You're probably less likely to just write to Putin and be like, I hate you, step down, this is terrible. That probably does happen. There are complaints in this data about things like human rights, elections, and I'll talk more about sort of what kind of politically loaded topics appear, but it's really about solving problems. It's also kind of a natural outcome of this hyper-centralized logic of the system, the power vertical, where sort of everything ends with Putin. He's kind of the ultimate backstop for getting things done, which is sort of a more contemporary iteration of this classic good czars, bad boyars dynamic, where, you know, Putin's invincible, he kind of can solve any problem, he can get things done, but everybody else, every other level of government, they're kind of incompetent, they're corrupt, they're not really that good at doing stuff. If you want something done, you have to let Putin know, and then he will fix it. And that's actually something that a lot of activists believe as well. It's something I encountered doing field work with urban activists in Moscow. A lot of them believed that this problem shouldn't be happening, and if we could only reach the right level of government to inform them that it is happening, then it would be fixed. And Putin is kind of the ultimate conclusion of that. And a lot of those urban activists did use this system. And then last, it's a pretty low cost thing to do. To put that in non-political science terms, it's easy. You just have to fill out an online form and you send it off, and the government has to respond to your problem. So it's a pretty low stakes thing to do. Who is using this system? So legally, these appeals can be submitted by individuals of any nationality and citizenship status, so all Russians, but also foreign people in Russia, stateless persons. Foreign governments can submit these, and collectivities of individuals can submit them. As I mentioned, it's pretty common for activist groups to send these appeals about their issue. However, the presidential administration doesn't release detailed data about where these are coming from. For the purposes of this presentation, or for looking at this data, I'm generally assume that this is being used by people who are regime supporters, or people who are just pragmatists. It doesn't really matter what they think about the regime, but they understand that this is a way to potentially get their problem resolved, or sort of just kind of make some progress on that. So you wouldn't really use this system if you didn't believe that the government could and might make a difference in your grievance. And you also probably wouldn't use this system if you think you're taking on really significant personal risk, you're putting yourself in danger by complaining to the government. So here's some data on the geographic dispersion of these complaints. I know there's kind of a lot of information here. On the y-axis is just the total number of appeals coming from these different federal districts. And really the only important thing to take away from this is that the appeals are coming from the population centers, of course, the central district. If you scale this by the population, it's basically proportionate to the population. So there's no sort of outlier district that's like sending really a lot of appeals, far more than they should by the number of people there. As of October, there are 4 regions of Ukraine that are now considered constituent entities of the Russian Federation. And at the top here, we have complaints from appeals from those regions. They've gotten about 6,000 appeals from those regions. And at the bottom, we have appeals from foreign governments. The reason these are so kind of compressed looking is that they're on the same axis as this data is, which is why I'm showing them to you separately. So why would the Putin administration leave a system like this in place? And the answer to that is that these kinds of systems are really useful for autocrats, and they're actually pretty common in contemporary autocratic states around the world. And that's because modern autocracies often try to find ways to appear consultative without inviting the instability that comes with actually asking people what they think via voting. So a lot of work has been done on this in China. You have these input institutions that collect information so that the government can address these problems without letting collective action happen. We also know that individualizing these conflicts into complaint systems prevents people from collaborating on them. So if you force them to submit complaints separately, they can't really come together and get involved in collective action. It also helps distract citizens from poor government performance. Isa Ding has done work on this in China as well, where complaints about intractable problems, in the case she's looking at environmental issues, are met with these kind of like performative investigations to sort of make a show that you're doing something when you know you can't really do anything. Hannah Chapman's looked at direct line and shown that participatory technologies actually improve public opinion, even when there's no grievance resolution resulting from them. Again, as I already mentioned, in Russia, we have this tradition of good czars, bad boyars, where we can kind of shift the blame from the president to lower levels of government. And this is one way that the state can do that literally for people's problems. You write to the president with a complaint and they assign a lower level of government to deal with it. And then last, new work on information autocracy from Guryev and Treisman has argued that the impression of competence is really important to these contemporary authoritarian regimes. Last, with increasing repression, it becomes more difficult to collect information because you are repressing the sort of elements of society that produce that information, right? This is a great way around that because instead of having to run opinion polls or rely on the media, people will just send their opinions directly to you, and you can gather information that way. So looking at these reports, I'm just going to show you the covers of these reports over recent years. So until February 2014, we had this amazing kind of 3D bubble map of Russia. No doubt a very professional graphic designer created this. Then in March 2014, they added Crimea there. And then in October of last year, it was no longer clear where Russia actually existed on a map. And so we transitioned to this rendering of the Kremlin. Okay, so looking at the reports themselves, they are extremely difficult to understand. This data is not clearly presented. I know you can't read this, but even if you could read it, it would not make sense to you. So there are narrative reports of the data, and then this quantitative data presented using every formatting option imaginable. Here in this, the title of this table is actually right here at the top, is this entire paragraph. So a lot of the text is using this like super formal, excessive language that really obscures the meaning of the text. There's also almost no what I would consider time series data presented in this. The table you're looking at, these are all actually time series presentations. What they're doing here is comparing, this is from a September report, they're comparing Septembers over the last 10 years. They don't compare the month to the previous months, they compare it to the same month in previous years. I don't think that's very useful, but whatever. Why would they be doing this? Why release these reports but make them so impossible to understand? Part of that is because these sort of technocratic initiatives for open data sharing that are sort of window dressing of democracy really conflict with authoritarian desires to suppress negative information. So you can release the information, but just make it really difficult to understand, and then no one's going to draw negative conclusions from it. So this is the table that the data I'm using is extracted from. And I know it's pretty self-explanatory, but I'll just read the title here. Identification at all levels of government of the number of titles of questions in accordance with the new standard thematic classifier that are of the greatest interest to applicants from the titles of questions that are of increased interest to applicants. Right? So what we have here is this text column. These are the topics that the Kremlin has assigned to the various complaints. So they read the appeals, they process the appeals into these thematic topics, and then that's what's released in the reports, not the raw data. It then has the number of reports or the number of appeals in that first column. And then the rest of these are sort of comparisons to the previous years. There's also this ID number. And these tables in the reports are generally like 8 to 15 pages long. So unfortunately, they don't use standardized topics across the years or standardized ID numbers for the topics. So I had to do a lot of recoding to make this usable. So each report has around 300 topics over the course of 2 years that produced 1,200 topics. I then recoded those to around 200, selected those that had received at least 500 appeals. I also dropped appeals about honorific titles, requests to visit with various government offices, and requests about status of previous appeals. And then I kind of assigned those to major thematic areas and sort of consolidated them just for the purpose of this presentation. So I'm not showing you, 85 graphs. This analysis covers 75 to 95% of the appeals that were received each month, and in total covers almost 700,000 appeals. This just represents the number of appeals that we're talking about here in darker blue. That's the number that I'll be discussing. And again, you can see that there's not only not an increase in, not a decrease since the war started, but actually since mobilization, a very pronounced increase in appeals to the president. So I know that you're all thinking that this data can't be trusted because it's produced by the Kremlin. Why would they release anything that's negative? Of course, there's clearly been some censoring and sanitization of this data. We don't know what has been removed from it because I don't have the raw complaints. But there are a lot of topics in it that are politically controversial, things like human rights, complaints about the internal ministry and security services and things like that. However, the words war, special military operation, and Ukraine do not appear in the data. Instead, there are terms like Russian involvement in conflicts on foreign soil. So there are topics that are related to the war, which I'll talk about in detail. Even if this data is not perfect, it's still instructed to know what the government is releasing information about and circulating internally. And it's giving us more of a sort of a rough idea of trends, another point of information in our kind of repertoire, rather than like a really clear point estimate on what people are thinking and feeling right now. Okay, so these are the major thematic areas that I'm looking at. At the top, we have the economy and the military, politics, and social policies. And these are the percentage of all appeals that are about each issue. And I'll go through these one by one. You can see the economy, never a big target of appeals outside of March 2022. Since the invasion has started, the military has been the subject of significantly more appeals, and there's sort of a lot of variation about politics and social policies. All right, so starting with the military, these are the topics within the military area: foreign policy, international conflicts, and then the next four topics are really about mobilization and military service. So payments to military personnel and their families, mobilization itself and military service, military equipment, supplies, training, and leadership, and prisoners of war. I'm going to look at these separately. We're going to separate out the mobilization topics from the conflict topics. So this is a plot of changes in the conflict topics over time. The pink or red category, that's foreign policy, international politics, and Russia's participation in international organizations and international cooperation. So you see this is increasing as we get into the start of the war. During that period of negotiation, by the summer, there are really almost no appeals about international cooperation and foreign policy. At that point, it's pretty unlikely that diplomacy is going to resolve that conflict. On the other hand, these blue topics, which are participation in international conflicts, the activity of the military abroad, and Russia's ability to defend its borders, really blow up at the time of the invasion, of course. Now, we should not look at this and assume that these are people writing to the president and asking him to end the war. That is almost certainly not what's going on. And the reason that I say that is that these do not decrease with the laws that were passed preventing the criticism of the armed forces or fake news about the military and things like that. Probably what's happening here is that these are complaints about Russian military performance, because they peak when Russian military progress in the southeast front stalls, and then again with the Ukrainian counteroffensive that was successful in the fall. Okay. So looking at the mobilization topics, so you can see here, unsurprisingly, these dramatically increased at the time of mobilization. But there were major concerns or rising concerns here even before the war started. In green, the topics covered by the green category are mobilization, the draft, military commissariats, problems with entering or leaving the armed forces, problems with military contracts, medical exemptions, and martial law. So I think no one's surprised to see that these increased with mobilization. But if you look at the darker purple category, we see that these are problems with appeals about military equipment, military supplies, training, and the leadership of the military. And those also really start increasing once mobilization hits. So people aren't just concerned with mobilization, they're concerned with what is happening in the military and how well supplied are these people, how well prepared are these. The rest of the world learned that the Russian military was not very well supplied or trained in the spring when the war started. Russians only became concerned about this once mobilization hit. So this, I think, is a sign that they're getting that information from people who have been mobilized, or perhaps they're just more engaged in it now. And the last thing I want to point out here is the blue category, which is benefits to people in the military, veterans, and their families, which is also a rising share of concerns. We know that monetary benefits are a big motive for people to join the military in Russia. But there's also concerns here, problems here with actually accessing those benefits. And I'm going to return to this later. The last thing I want to point out here is that although mobilization is over, these concerns have not gone away. And even in December, were about 1/3 of the concerns that were addressed to the president. Those two graphs were on different y-axes. And here I'm putting them on the same. So you can see how much greater the concern is with mobilization than it was with the performance of the military or with peaceful resolutions to the conflict. So I know this is not really a surprise, but when we think about how Russians might want to hold the government accountable for this war, it's probably not going to be about the kind of international dimensions. It's much more likely to be about the personal cost to Russians that they're experiencing. Okay, so these are the economic problems. I'm not going to talk about these all in detail. I'm going to put them all on one graph together for you. So again, I think fairly clear to look at this and see what is happening. So in general, Russians don't complain a lot about the economy. And then in March 2022, when you have this sort of avalanche of sanctions and companies leaving Russia, there's this enormous spike in concerns. This is over 12,000 pieces of correspondence. And the largest category here were concerns about prices and price. However, these concerns went away pretty quickly. In April, there were only 2,000 pieces of correspondence, and by December, there were only 291 pieces of correspondence about the economy, which is below what it was before the war. So what's happening here? It's possible that Russians are just very reassured by the handling of the economic situation, but I don't think that would account for this complete drop-off. It's possible that they have other concerns that are more pressing, like mobilization, that they're appealing to the government about. It's also possible that the people who are really concerned about things like the conditions of doing business in the banking industry have just left the country and are not even around to be using this complaint system at all. And I think the last possibility here is that people understand that the sanctions regime does not leave a lot of wiggle room for the regime as long as it is not willing to end the war. And so complaining about these things is probably not going to have a real positive outcome. Okay. So now looking at political grievances. So these are the main categories of political grievances. I'm just going to talk about complaints about the federal executive and complaints about regional governments. However, I do want to point out that issues with the judicial system are in almost every month, the largest category of complaints by a wide margin. So what are the complaints that they're getting about these different branches of government? This is the information that I have about them based on these reports. So complaints to the federal executive, the topic is activities of federal state bodies, ministries, and other federal executive bodies. I've also included here constitutional and federal law issues and the rights and freedoms of man and citizen. On the regional, local, and Duma level, again, it's just the activities of local government, the activities of regional executive authorities, and the activities of the Duma. There were almost no complaints about the Duma. This is really about local government and regional government. But again, we don't know exactly what they're complaining about. It's just something about this level of government. So we're going to compare these. And I'm going to direct your attention where it probably already is to the area after mobilization was enacted. So we all know that when mobilization was put into effect, it's a federal policy that was announced by Putin, and then it was left to the regional governors to fulfill certain quotas of mobilized individuals. And they did that in a very chaotic and almost terroristic kind of way, where there were all these horror stories of people, men being, seized on the metro, whole towns having their male population sent off to the front, people who should have been exempt getting drafted. It was a very scary time. It is also reflective of this kind of sort of traditional practice almost in the Putin regime at this point of announcing a really unpopular policy and then leaving it to the governors to enact it so that they can be the target of blame. They can get the reputational blowback from enacting those policies. And I think the interesting thing that you see here is that this is almost like a secondary effect of the problems of mobilization. These are not complaints about mobilization. These are complaints about the activities, unspecified, of these branches of government. And while there are more complaints about the federal executive since mobilization went into effect, it's really not out of line with what was happening in 2021. But the regional and local government really skyrocketing. You're getting almost 12,000 complaints about them in October 2022. I'm going to return to this in a moment with some concluding thoughts to bring this all together. Okay, so looking at social policies, these are the social policies that I'm considering here. There was not a lot of significant variation in most of these topics. I have also, for all of these topics, I have like the graph for each of them. If you're concerned about one of these particular topics, we can talk about it in the Q&A. What I'm going to talk about here are these social security kind of benefits. So the first is benefits to families, orphans, and the disabled. This category is really about benefits to families with multiple children. These are cash benefits, in-kind benefits, and in some cases, land plots that the government gives to families that have children. Pensions is a topic I'm sure we're all familiar with, and then just these general social security benefits. I'm going to put these all into a chart together with the military benefits issue that we talked about already. So this is what that looks like. In purple, we have the benefits to families with children. This category, as I said, also includes orphans and disabled people, but far, far, far and away, this is about benefits to families with children. In May, 56% of communication to the presidential administration was about benefits to families with children. That's over 22,000 pieces of correspondence in 1 month alone. And while that was really unusually high, it's actually not that far out of line with how many appeals are received about that issue on a regular basis, even in data that I'm not presenting here that goes back into the past. It's a really big deal. We also see, again, in blue, the military payments coming in, and those are also a form of benefits to families because these are benefits to the families of military service people, not just to the military members themselves. I don't know why there was such a big spike in concern about family benefits. It could have been a policy change, or it could have been like a letter writing campaign that those people were organizing. But again, this is like a pretty consistent concern. Now in green, we have pensions. I think some people might be surprised to see that there are so few complaints about pensions that are reaching the presidential level, because as Russia watchers, we tend to really focus on the issue of pensions, but they are simply not causing enough problems, it seems, to get people to complain to the president about them. And the reason that I say that is that it is a highly politicized issue. It's a highly politicized issue in Russia as well. And those people, I think if they were having problems with their pensions, they know about this system, they would probably be using it. I think the more likely situation here is that there are other effective ways to resolve issues with your pensions that don't exist for these other types of benefits, like the benefits to families. Okay, so I'm gonna focus on two implications of this now. So the first is that regional governors are going to be shouldering the reputational consequences of this war. And I know that this is not news to anybody. We've watched mobilization unfold. We've seen this happen. Actually, a similar thing happened with the COVID pandemic just recently. But we're seeing rising dissatisfaction with regional governors that's linked to mobilization, but is not purely about mobilization. It's also about other features of regional governance. Looking into the future, there are going to be more problems with this, right? Regional governments are the ones that are responsible for these military benefits. They're also responsible for the benefits to the families and other types of social benefits like that. Those are not federally administered. They're administered by the regions, who often don't have the resources or the competence or the cleanliness of doing business, let's say, to actually implement those programs as they're supposed to be implemented. We're also pretty likely to see more mobilization ahead as the war continues. It's possible that'll be concentrated in the regions that didn't have protests the first time around, or where it was a little bit easier the first time around, but we're going to be seeing more problems with this. I don't think we're going to be seeing, revolutions in the regions, but there is good reason to care about what's happening in regional politics. Governors are going to be frustrated by this. We already saw them get frustrated under COVID when they were getting this reputational blowback and seeing their ratings take huge hits. At the same time, they can't really do anything about it because they understand that their role is to protect the regime. They are part of the regime and their job is to maintain stability in their region. So they're not going to be rising up against Putin, because they've been insulted by the public. And they also don't really have a lot of opportunity to coordinate against Putin, even if they wanted to. What we are going to be seeing is probably a lot more instability in the regions, directed to the regional governors as this moves forward. And we could be seeing more turnover in regional governors if regional stability declines and is not something that they can guarantee. That's really what the sort of pact between the regime and the governors is about. They deliver elections and regional stability, and the regime can kind of like make them do whatever they want in exchange for their position. So we could be seeing more instability there. And then I want to return to this point about social benefits. Social benefits other than pensions deserve our attention going forward into sort of these mid-stage of the war. So these appeals indicate that benefits to families in general are consistent or a rising concern among Russians. And the fact that they're appealing to the government about this indicates that they've already been somewhat politicized. So they're not just accepting that as a status quo, they're angry about it in some way, or they're dissatisfied about it in some way. So if the economic impact of sanctions start hitting Russia in a way where it has to decide which benefits it's going to pay, it could be in a really difficult position. I think Putin would probably rather resign than paying because it is such a controversial issue. These family benefits and benefits to service members are also could potentially be a source of some unrest or at least some trouble for the regime. Part of why I think that is that these are really morally compelling grievances. We're talking about the state's ability to provide benefits to children, basically. There isn't really a more highly morally politicized topic in Russian politics than children. They're also deeply related to state legitimacy. You want to draft people and send them out to the front to die, and then you can't even provide the benefits to their families that you're supposed to be providing. If this gets out of hand, it could really be an issue that really upsets a lot of people and could produce some organizing. On the other hand, these are also issues that are really highly individualized. Navigating the state benefit process in any country, especially in Russia, is really difficult and highly specific. The government has used the sort of individualization tactic many times with people trying to access benefits who are also trying to organize into a bigger movement, and it does really interrupt their organization. And of course, we know that in the present moment, there are many obstacles to organizing any kind of collective action or civil society in Russia right now. But I think this is something that we really need to watch and maybe shift some of the attention we've been putting on pensions to these other social issues that are quite important to people. So in addition to that, just a couple more takeaway points. Again, just to emphasize that mobilization really changed things domestically for what people were paying attention to and what was upsetting them. So it refocused, there had been some moderate attention on military performance before that. With mobilization, there's a lot more interest on what's happening with the military and how well they're able to do their job. And that's continued even after mobilization has ended. Issues with pensions and the economy appear to be stable for now, and we're not seeing those effective sanctions leading people to put more pressure on the government, and at least using this appeal system as the way to put pressure on the government. They're not expressing those concerns at this time, although that could, of course, change in the future. And then I just want to emphasize again that these appeals are just another great data point that we have about what Russians are thinking in a time when we have limited access to them. And there's much more to unpack in these reports. They're each like 80 to 150 pages long, and I just looked at one single table for this presentation. So thanks for your time. As I said, I do have all of those individual topics as little graphs if you want to see any of those issues over the last 2 years, and I'm looking forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Sasha, for a great talk. I'm going to kick off the discussion with my chair's prerogative with one small and one bigger question. So the first one is, it's a really fascinating data point, I think, that tracks well, but also differently than a lot of other information sources we have about how Russians feel about the war. So I was wondering if you could just spend a couple of minutes and contextualize a little bit. You talked a little bit about how surveys have really low response rates, and we might be getting some kind of bias or misinformation by relying on those. How would you contextualize the truthfulness or representativeness of the information of the appeals vis-a-vis both surveys and vis-a-vis the actual public opinion that's in in Russia. Do you think we should be relying more on this type of appeals data and less on surveys, or correcting somehow because of that? And then the second one is this, just kind of the regime seems to face a trade-off with responses to these type of things. Whereas if it responds to every single complaint, then people might realize that if they send a complaint this way, they're going to actually get recourse. And that could be overwhelming. And like you said, create some expectations of performance that it might not meet. But if it refuses to respond at all, it could be seen as, completely ignorant or neglecting of citizen complaints. So it seems like you've identified a really interesting conundrum or puzzle where there's going to be rising individualized demands on the state. And I wanted you to kind of think a little bit more about how you expect the regime to react when let's just take benefits beyond pensions. Do you think is it going to be targeting resources towards people that complain, targeting resources towards people that have the ability to mobilize against it? How is it going to respond with limited resources to what you're seeing as a pretty escalating pressure from below at a time of really limited resources? Then I'll happily open it up to everybody else.
Yeah, those are great questions. Thanks. So how would I contextualize the truthfulness of this data versus surveys and versus sort of like the underlying real reality of what people are thinking? So I'm not a survey methodologist, so I don't actually use surveys in Russia. But first of all, I don't think, as you suggested, we should be relying on this more than surveys. It's just a very different mechanism of information generation, right? With a survey, you come up with a list of questions. Generally, you're trying to make it sort of as short as possible to prevent people from getting tired and moving on with their lives. You don't want to ask anything that's too controversial because people don't want to answer those questions. And that's where you get the non-response rate, or you get preference falsification where they're not being truthful. With this, people have to elect to engage in this process and spend their own time doing it. And we don't really know, I'm not aware of any studies that have been done on who engages with this system. So it's sort of, you can think about different personality types who would do this. Like some people probably do it all the time. There's actually warnings on the website about like how not to abuse it. But I'm sure you can imagine, some curmudgeonly, babushka just like shooting off all of these appeals to the president. On the other hand, like there are people who are, using this in a much more deliberate way, or maybe more moderate way, to complain about something. And then there are people who have a lot of grievances who would never use this system. I think that's also certainly quite common. I mean, like Russians aren't, they're not the most politically active or politically engaged population in the world. So I think they're just getting at different things. One thing I like about this data is that, I mean, each of these reports covers like 300 different topic areas. You can't write a survey that would cover all of these things. You can't write a survey that's like, do you like the president? And also, how concerned are you about animal attacks in your village? But people are concerned about that. Like people write to the president on a regular basis about animal attacks in their village. That's not a major issue. But that is the kind of stuff that you can get out of this data. There's a lot of really granular information about things that are concerning people. Where this sits on the spectrum of like real reality and what real public opinion is, I think that's a pretty difficult question to answer. This isn't going to give you information about like how much people like actually support the regime, how much they would support an alternative to Putin. Some of those bigger questions that we really care about. We don't really care about what the real reality is of people's like attitudes towards animal attacks in their village. So that's why I say this is just sort of a complement to the other information sources that we have. What kind of responses are expected, and isn't there some kind of downside to the regime for setting this up by setting inappropriate expectations of response? So the regime itself has set the expectations for response already, that they will respond to all of these complaints. I actually haven't, these reports contain information about what level of government has been assigned, like what government organ has been assigned to resolve the issue, or what number of issues, down to like the sub-city level in some cases for like major cities. And I haven't been able to look at that yet. I think that we should also not confuse assigning responsibility for resolution with resolution. You can assign responsibility for resolving a problem to another organ of government, and then they can just, drag that process out, however long they want. They don't actually have to resolve it in a meaningful way. And that delay can really take the wind out of someone's sails, let's say. If they were really fired up about something, maybe they were going to have a protest, they're going to complain to the president, they're going to do all these things. They get assigned someone who's going to resolve this situation, then, they can wait and see what will happen. These delay tactics are really effective in undermining, people's enthusiasm for solving these problems in a lot of cases. But we don't really know at this point how the government uses this data, to put it bluntly.
Let's open it up. We'll have questions. Yeah, Jill. If you could just introduce yourself.
Yeah, hi. Jill Doherty from Georgetown. Oh, sorry. Jill Doherty from Georgetown University. I thought this was really very interesting. And I know the last point you say much more to unpack about the response to these appeals, but look at what Putin did just, at the State of the Union address, State of the Nation address, where he talked about psychological help for families, all sorts of things that I actually didn't expect. They were pretty specific. How much it costs, I don't know, but he seemed very concerned about exactly some of the things that you're talking about in this. So I have no idea, but I'd just be interested in, if you're going to take this a little further, it seems to me that it uncovers precisely some of the nitty-gritty issues Russians are thinking about. Thanks.
Yeah, that's, I think, exactly what I would hope to do in the next stages of this project. Actually, on the same website that posts these reports also has regular announcements of instructions that have been given to various government officials, again, all the way down to city level officials, to do make certain policy changes, which are potentially related to these complaints as well. So one element of this project that we're hoping to do is to look at that data. And they have also progress updates on how well they're doing at meeting those goals. So we're trying to hopefully pair some of this data with that kind of real response data. Thanks.
Ivan?
Thank you. My name is Ivan Famina. I'm from SIPA. My question is about the data about the prisoners of war. So I've noticed there is a rise after the mobilization, but actually the problem started earlier than mobilization. So how do you explain that people start to get more concerned with the prisoners of war after the mobilization? Is there any correlation with the number of prisoners of war, or just they were less concerned when it was about the professional people in the military?
Yeah, so as you can see from this graph, there are not a lot of complaints about or appeals about prisoners of war, but you're right that it's actually probably clearer if I show you the other one again.
I think there was more, yeah.
Ooh, where did it go? Well, so it's the yellow here at the bottom. It's a pretty low number, but yes, I think I don't have data. I haven't compared this to the data on the number of prisoners of war, but I think this is just sort of representative of, in this post-mobilization era, people are a lot more concerned about sort of the direct effects of military service. This is potentially people maybe know people who've become prisoners of war. I mean, the war has been going on for longer. This is also post counteroffensive, or the counteroffensive is in October. So that also produced prisoners of war. But I don't know how that reflects on the actual numbers of prisoners of war. But again, as I mentioned earlier, there seems to be a trend here post-mobilization and also post-counteroffensive of people being a little bit more concerned with what's actually happening to people in the military who are on the front.
Head back.
Hello, I'm Yaroslav Bedinsky, scholar here in LSU. I have a question. Is it clear from your survey how many such appeals were, so to say, satisfied? And if yes, which issues most of all? Thank you.
Thanks for that. So that data does and doesn't exist. I don't have it right now, but in the reports, they do, as I said, they do have sections where the reports assign responsibility for dealing with these issues to different government offices. I don't know to what extent there's no like follow-up. So I only have the report for like September 2022. There's no return to that, you know, in the next report to see like how people felt later. But they are required within 30 days to investigate and respond to all of these complaints. So unfortunately, I don't really have a good answer to that question.
In the front. Yeah, yes, please. There's time. That's fine.
Thank you for an interesting presentation. My name is Yaroslav Martanyuk, and I'm formerly a researcher with Radio Liberty in Munich. And my specialty was public opinion research in the 80s in the Soviet Union, and then later on Russia and all the 15 republics. I would like to know if you have an opinion on the reliability of surveys by polling outfits like Levada that show high, 70% support for Putin. Now, based on my experience of working with Russians in the past, there's always been a high number of refusals to be interviewed. And when I say high numbers, 10, maybe 15% refuse to participate for whatever reasons. I just heard recently that refusal rate has jumped to over 50%.
It's like 95% now.
Refusal?
Yeah.
Oh my God. Okay, well, that answered my question. People are afraid, reluctant to say, to express their opinions.
Yeah.
And so these surveys have no validity as far as I'm concerned, or very little, very little.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the problem with survey research right now, is that it's just difficult to get people to want to participate at all. I know Bryn Rosenfeld has written about this recently. Again, I'm not a specialist, I don't do surveys, so I'm not fully abreast of what's happening here. But I do think that when we talk about how reliable polls are from the West, it tends to be because we really want a poll that's going to show us that everybody hates Putin. Like we think they're unreliable because there's something we want to see and it didn't show us what we wanted to see. And I think that we have to really appreciate the possibility that while there's errors in these polls and there is preference falsification, it is also possible that they're not that far off, that people really do trust Putin. They do continue to support him. They either don't care about or support the war. And that's not just like Russians haven't just been living in a big lie for the last, however long we have felt this way. So there definitely is a lot of error. There's certainly information that we'd love to have that we can't get because of these problems. But I think we also have to also acknowledge that maybe just the reality that we want to be false is real.
My name is Alexander Moskalenko. I'm also from CIPA. My question is about the rise of these appeals to Putin, right? Don't you think that this is a sign of that more and more Russians accept Putin as legitimate president? I mean, before they were kind of different, but when they come on some kind of difficult situation, they turn to Putin. So we have these numbers that are rising, and doesn't mean that they accept Putin as the last resort, legitimate source for solving their problem. Isn't it the sign of support of Putin during the wartime, which the war be the factor that Russian people accept as legitimate factor for Putin's staying in power? Thank you.
I think that it's kind of observationally equivalent. People who think Putin's legitimate and great, and he's like the rightful ruler of Russia, and that's why they're writing to him, and people who are like, doesn't really matter, Putin's not the rightful leader of Russia, but he is the leader of Russia for now, and I have the problem and I want someone to solve it, and he's the person who solves problems, and that's just how it is. I don't like it, but that's reality. So we can't really, based on this data, we can't separate those two types of people who are just like pragmatic about it and who are like enthusiastic supporters. I think what we could be seeing, based on what I've just argued, is maybe even more loss of faith in regional leaders who could solve these problems without having to turn to Putin. I don't know if that would make people think he's more or less legitimate, but it's not, like a zero
If you
solution.
turn to somebody with a problem, so you accept his authority as legitimate.
Yeah. I mean, I think so. Whether or not you believe that that authority is, you're enthusiastically supporting that authority, or you're just like realistically
Not
accepting that that's just the condition of things. I don't think there's a difference. This gentleman in the back has had his hand up for.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Thank you. My name is Jonathan. I'm a graduate student in political communication at American University. Well, what role do you think the media in terms of framing, agenda setting has played and shaping the opinions of Russian and also EU citizens regarding this invasion in Ukraine? And also, how do you think this has impacted, the world public debate and also policy interest in our decisions?
So you mean, how do I think the media has impacted?
How do you take like the media in terms of agenda setting, global media, or is this impacting the opinion of Russians, but also EU citizens? And also, how do you think this has impacted policy decisions?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't study the media specifically, but I think you really can't overstate the importance of the media here. In Russia, in March, basically as of March 2022, there was no independent media in Russia, and there was even quite limited ability to freely express yourself on the internet, which, I mean, there's a lot of variation there at least, but that was previously sort of a safe space to say what you wanted to. So Russians really are living in this kind of like information bubble at this point where they don't have easy access, even compared to what they had a year ago. Well, at this point, not a year ago, a year and 2 months ago. So they're really getting exposed to these state narratives that are sort of increasingly extremist almost. And, that really does affect people. Russia's always been a country that has consumed a lot of news, a lot of information via television. So it certainly is affecting what people are thinking. And I think that's also part of why this mobilization graph is so interesting, because people aren't getting that information about the condition of the military service on the news. Like we got it in the West, like I said earlier, we all knew that the Russian military was in pretty shoddy condition, like right when the invasion happened, essentially. And Russians, it seems like, only got that information once mobilization hit and they started getting, phone calls from the front lines and things like that. Yeah, I really can't speak to how the media has affected the EU policy. It's just sort of outside my area, but yeah, I hope that answered your question.
We just have one more. Ailey?
Ailey Funder from the State Department. So thank you very much for all the work that you did helping make sense of this very unwieldy data. And I have more of a clarification question about what else is out there. So apologies if I missed this in the paper and in your presentation, but are people also sending appeals to regional authorities? I'm assuming that they are, and I'm wondering, clearly they're going to be addressing foreign policy, international politics to the president more than regional officials. But I guess I'm curious, I mean, not asking you to go through whatever 85 regions worth of those appeals, but what could we be missing by seeing what's being addressed to the federal level versus more local officials? Thanks.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, and I can't really answer it because I have not looked at the regional governors, whenever they're part of their website that would have this. I believe you can also address appeals to the governor. I know from my, I've done a lot of research on municipal politics in Moscow, looking at how those activists have, so about issues in Moscow that the city of Moscow can resolve on its own without federal intervention. And those activists, they're trying to hit on all channels. They're complaining to the city administration, they're complaining to people in the Duma, they're complaining really anywhere that will receive a complaint. And they're also, of course, in many cases, those guys, because they're in Moscow, are going to the presidential administration in person repeatedly. So they do tend to appeal multiple places. But again, just speaking from that case, they have tremendously little faith that the city government will do anything to resolve a problem that the city government itself has created. I think I can't actually really speak to how similar Moscow is to the rest of Russia, but there is sort of an abiding belief that regional governments are really corrupt and incompetent. Whereas even if the federal government is corrupt and incompetent, they're a little bit less so, or you can kind of like get them to sort of, you can get Putin to kind of taskmaster local government and into helping you basically. So it would be really interesting to look at that data and see what the kinds of issues are that they are looking at, or that they're getting appeals about. And I think the data is out there.
So unfortunately, we're out of time, but if you have questions, Sasha will be hanging out after the talk for a couple of minutes. Come and find her. Thank you so much for coming. This is our 6th out of 7, so we have one more talk next month. I encourage you to come back with another new voice, but have a great evening. Thanks again.
Yeah, thanks everybody.